Exploring the bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Wow. Tim, I'm being dragged into another dimension here. I just feel like I'm in a parallel universe, and I'm trying to get back. You want to extend your hand there, and I'll try to grab onto it and come back into reality. Good evening, Tim. How are you doing out there in Jasper, Indiana?
Is it a dimension of sight and sound, Tim?
Well, I hope so. Wow, that's a real weird space to be in. But we're in a real weird space tonight, and we've got a jam-packed program. When I say jam-packed, I mean jam-packed. Now, every episode or so, we talk about synchronicities. My life has kind of been made up of there's one right after another, starting at a very early age. And it continues on. In fact, so much so that we decided to put together a book. And just by coincidence, and I use that word in quotes, the book is coming out this week. And the book is titled The Matrix Control System of Philip K. Dick and the Paranormal Synchronicities of Timothy Beckley. Now, just by, again, I use in quotes, coincidence, this happens to be the weekend of the Philip K. Dick Science Fiction Film Festival being held here for several days, I think actually 4 or 5 days in Manhattan. It runs from, we'll find out exactly because we have the promoter of the event with us, Daniel Abella. Daniel, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Well, Daniel, I know you've had the event in the past, and I did not attend, but my friend and associate, Mark Brinkerhoff, sent me a notice of this, and I said, well, this is kind of, again, in quotes, strange, because the festival is the weekend that our book that we've been working on so hard, that's now up to 437 pages, is due to come out. So I said, I've got to get in touch with the festival and tell them this, and have someone on from the program to discuss this with us, because we have quite a few listeners in the metropolitan New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area who I'm sure will be fascinated by this, and who probably would enjoy attending, and it is very modestly priced. Why don't you give us a little bit about the history? Are you the actual organizer?
Yes, I am. I'm the organizer and founder of the Synchronicities system.
And this is your 5th year?
This is my 5th year. Yes, it's very exciting to. I think we've really put together some really cool elements.
And why don't you tell us a little bit about the concept of the festival? When is it going to be held? What dates is it that's coming up? And exactly what the concept of the program is.
Well, the festival runs from May 25th all the way to May 30th, and we'll be at 4 different locations in New York City. The Museum of the Moving Image is going to be Friday night. Soho Playhouse is going to be Saturday, Sunday. Producers Club on Monday, and Cervantes Institute on Tuesday. Mm-hmm. During this time, we will be screening over 100 features and shorts from all over the world. And we'll have numerous panels as well, all of them in honor of the great, yes.
Well, I was very surprised to see that you're having Jacques Vallée and Dr. Harold Pudoff on the one of the panels.
That is correct. There, it just so happens there is a short which accepted into the festival called Lives Gone Wild, which is loosely based on. Well, it's actually a biopic on Ingo Swann, which is the first. Well, not the first, but the first psychic viewer, which was commissioned by the military.
Well, we knew Ingo Swann because he was a member of our New York City Fortean Society that I was on the board of directors of, in which John Keel, of course, ran. So Ingo came to quite a number of the meetings and joined us for lunch afterwards. He certainly was one of the greatest, remote viewers of all time, if not recognized as the best. So you're bringing people in like Jacques Vallée and Dr. Pudoff from California and all over the country.
Absolutely, and I'm very, very excited. It turned out that and I wasn't aware of this, that Ingo Swann knew Philip K. Dick. They were friends.
That I did not know, or I would have included that in the book.
Yeah, so that's something. Well, I think Philip K. Dick knew a lot of cool people. I mean, I just
indeed, yes.
He really knew. Yeah, and that was part of his one of the real positive attributes.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is in our book a chapter by Brad Steiger. Now, Brad Steiger, of course, is one of the great literary giants in the paranormal field for many, many years, and he knew Philip K. Dick. And Brad contributed a chapter in which he reveals, probably for the first time, I think, that Philip K. Dick believed that he was a star person. In fact, he filled out Brad Steiger's questionnaire, and they had a number, I understand, of late night telephone calls back and forth discussing UFOs and things of that matter. Which is kind of interesting because most science fiction writers seem to be totally opposed to anything that's UFO or paranormal, related.
Yes, I've seen that. Mm-hmm. Well, that's what makes Philip K. Dick a little bit different from most of them, is that he, as you know, he personally had an experience which reveals certain dimensions and certain areas of reality, either intrapsychic or interpersonal, which perhaps other sci-fi writers never had the privilege to. So he was very open-minded, and I really feel that that sets him apart. Yes, and indeed he was a good friend of another writer who also claimed to be a star person, Robert Anton Wilson.
That's correct.
And we talk about Synchronicities, that period in time in 1974, both of them claimed to be receiving messages from Sirius, the star system Sirius.
We bring that out in the book. Now, how did you first get involved with Philip K. Dick? I mean, you seem to be a fairly young man. How I mean, were you a reader of science fiction and his books in particular? You don't wake up one morning and suddenly decide, well, I want to put together a festival based on somebody's intellectual property.
No, it actually came about because I think there were two things going on. I've always been drawn to a kind of philosophical approach to science fiction, not just pure technology, but more but human components, a human condition. And I've also read, came across a quote by Ursula Le Guin that compared Philip K. Dick to Jorge Luis Borges, a very famous also writer, more in magical realism. And the minute I saw that, I said, well, I got to read this guy. I mean, he sounds like our own homegrown Borges. That's her quotation. And I went ahead and started reading, actually, his later works, Valus and Transmigration of Timothy Archer, Divine Invasion, and started going back, literally backwards to his earlier stuff. So I was hooked, maybe because literally the very first book I read was Valis, and at that point I realized I came across someone who was more of a Gnostic philosopher than just a sci-fi writer. And I also happened to be a filmmaker, and I've been very intrigued and always inspired by multiple realities and parallel universes. And when I read that was one of Philip K. Dick's themes, it occurred to me, why not have a festival in his honor? To have not just have sci-fi films, but also films that incorporate how humans retain their humanity before systems that want to rob them of their humanity. And how do you remain dignified in a world that wants to take away that sense of? And I think his characters are just everyday people. They're not superheroes like what we see in the Hollywood adaptations, but they're very much everyday, introverted, sometimes lonely, or sometimes very solitary characters who are, they're struggling with the world, with this strange reality we all live in.
Daniel, I mean, have you yourself, have you had any, paranormal experiences or synchronicities that have stood out to you over the years?
Well, yeah, I've had a few of them. I mean, they were very odd. I mean, probably my first one is maybe when I was going back to when I was about maybe 7, 8, coming across a flower, which I at that time I looked, it was bleeding. It was a bleeding flower. Maybe it could have just been my imagination. But another time I saw a car that had no driver. I was on my parents. I was my 7, 8 years old. I looked across and said, wait a minute, there's no driver on the other side. But then more recently, I've had synchronicities dealing with people that are suggest that there's another level of reality of interconnectedness that usually hasn't been accepted by science, by conventional science. So I can't say that I've come across some major experiences, a UFO or anything of that nature, but I do seen enough to believe there's something out there beyond what standard orthodoxy explains.
That was always one of Phil's favorite subjects, the matter of reality. What is reality, and is the reality that we're experiencing the true reality? And so
right.
I mean, it's and it's especially significant now with all the talk that's coming from a number of philosophers and physicists on the possibility that our universe could actually be a simulation. So I mean, it seems like Phil was way ahead of his time on that.
Absolutely. I always get a chuckle when I see the video of him going before a group of journalists, and it was in 1977, I believe, in France, and saying we exist in a computer-generated reality, and everybody's just smiling, looking at each other, probably wondering what's going on over here. So, yeah, he was way ahead. I mean, I think that he was onto something. And I think his experience, what he like to refer to as 2374, may have had to do with, a lot of writers had experiences of that nature. I mean, we have Robert Anton Wilson, we have Whitley Strieber, who talks about visitation. Something happens. It could be an archetype that's activated, or it could be just crossing the threshold into another world. And then I'm not sure something, but he belongs to a community of writers that have had these experiences over the years.
Well, Jacques Vallée, who's going to be on your program, he has a synchronicity or two that we relate in the book. I happen to have here, Daniel, the exact quote from Philip K. Dick, which I figured that I would read from that festival in France. It says, "People claim to remember past lives. I claim to remember a different, very different present life. I know of nobody who has ever made this claim before, but I rather suspect that my experience is not unique. What perhaps is unique is my willingness to talk about it. We are living in a
Right.
computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs, and an alternative world branched off. And of course, Charles Fort, who was I guess the grandfather of the paranormal, literature, who wrote at least 4 very huge books. He talked about how Earth is like a farm, and we are somebody's property, and that's what
Right.
I've concluded after dozens and dozens of synchronicities, that. There is some other reality, and that this reality does have the ability to kind of alter our thinking and throw in some very strange and weird events into our lives. Now, what the meaning of them, these synchronicities and coincidences are, well, that's open to dispute and to a debate. But they certainly do happen. In fact, the things that I have, have occurred to me over the years are just absolutely incredible and phenomenal. I mean, as Tim can attest to, since he's been working on the graphics and laying out the book for the last month or so to get it out in time.
Well, Young used to say that the closer you work on the depth psychology, the closer you're working with the archetypes, the more synchronicities begin to emerge. So it wouldn't surprise me. I think that there are a series of connections there that are linking people to certain themes or certain subjects. I mean, one question I definitely want to ask Jacques is I've been just reading Forbidden Science, his diary, which is absolutely fascinating. It's actually kind of a very personal what someone went through in the 70s. It's a fascinating recount. But he talks about the physics of information. Back in 1977, he says, where is the and 40 years later, where is the physics of information? We're still stuck with this idea of space and time. But the most likely mental constructs, and in fact, we might just live in this sea of data. And Philip K. Dick, when he talks about VALIS, the vast active living intelligence or information system, well, I think he was onto something. I think there is just data. We retrieve the data through various filters. That seems to be a much better model for a lot of nonlinear phenomena, paranormal, than your standard space-time, models.
Now, I understand that, say, one of the films that you're previewing is Gods Among Us. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Gods Among Us is directed by Carolyn Corey, and she's amassed scientific evidence, that suggests that there are already amongst us ETs. They're basically extraterrestrials that live amongst us, and she actually will have we have a scientist, an astrophysicist, and is Rudy Child, and he was a good friend of John Mack. He will be part of the panel. Mark will also be on. I believe he'll be also in the panel. Bergenhoff, and we'll have a few experiencers talking about the UFO phenomenon and the experience of interacting with these beings. I think most people, as they walk around major cities, they come across others who don't seem real. There's something very alien about it, not just cold, but alien. And maybe these are some of the ETs that they're referring to. Well, certainly, Dr. Jacobs from Temple University seems to think so as well. Well, his take on it is that many of them are very malignant and have something very negative in mind. Whereas in the case of Carolyn, she believes they're all basically good ET.
Yeah.
So it's
Well, you know, in our book, we talk about the June 24, June 24th jinx, where all these UFO researchers have passed away on the anniversary of Kenneth Arnold's UFO sighting over Mount Rainier. Which there are a lot of synchronicities like this too. They're not necessarily good. They're not necessarily bad. They just happen. I mean, well, we could get into that. It's a long discussion, but basically, how can people get to the internet and find out about your program, and give us a telephone number and a web address and all?
Sure. The website is the Philip K. Dick Film Festival. The Philip K. Dick Film Festival.com. And that's the most direct way of reaching us. If they have any questions, they can email us at info@the Philip K. Dick Film Festival.
And when is Jacques Vallée and Dr. Putoff scheduled to speak? Because I'm sure that
Jacques is going to be coming in. Yes, he's going to be coming in on right after the documentary. So that's Saturday at 3:00. Mm-hmm. We'll run a panel for about 2 hours. We'll show the short documentary and then the panel that includes Jacques Vallée, Hal Putoff, Tim McNear, which was the first remote viewer that was, taught by Ingo Swann, the director, who also was a good friend of Ingo Swann. And
so the documentary, the documentary is on Ingo Swann.
It is on Ingo Swann. So
wonderful.
Yes, that's going to be 3 to 5. I also want to mention too that at 1:00 we have a film called How to Build a Time Machine, and that's based upon the works of two gentlemen whose lives were altered or shaped by H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. One of them is Dr. Ronald Mallett, who's currently working on his that theory of sending binary signals back in time. He'll be there, and also Robert Nosey, who is after reading the H.G. Wells' Time Machine, decided to devote the 20 years of his life to building a replica of that.
Wow. Well, this sounds like an event. This sounds like an event and a half, and I will be down there at some point. And I wish you well, and I hope you get the word out to many people, because I know there are a heck of a lot of Philip K. Dick fans and people who are into this, who would be interested in the program. And Daniel, I want to thank you for coming on and telling our listeners about your festival coming up.
Thank you for having me.
Next
and
weekend. You're welcome. You're very welcome. And
I look forward to meeting you. And
you bet.
Yeah.
And I think we have a break just coming up here in just a second.
Okay, great.
And then we will be back with our other two guests of the evening. And this has been the conversation.
Okay, great.
All right, we'll talk to you later.
Thank you, Daniel.
I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah.
Thanks, and we'll see you on Saturday.
You betcha.
Have a good night. Yeah, bye-bye.
Well, there we go. The Philip K. Dick Film Festival.
Now back to exploring the bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal. Your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Welcome back to Exploring the Bizarre right here on the mighty KCOR Digital Radio Network. And Tim, why don't we bring in our other guests tonight? We have with us Nick Redfern and Nomar Slevik. Now, Nick's going to be talking about his most recent book, The Roswell UFO Conspiracy, Exposing a Shocking and Sinister Secret. And Nomar has a couple of books that he's going to be talking about, UFOs Over Maine, Close Encounters from the Pine Tree State, and also Otherworldly Encounters, UFOs Over Maine, Volume 2. So, gentlemen, welcome to Exploring the Bizarre. Happy to have you with us tonight.
Thank you. Hey, guys.
Well, this is UFO month on Exploring the Bizarre. We're having 4 solid weeks of the boys from Topside. And of course, UFOs are kind of our favorite subject, although we don't go out of our way to discriminate against the paranormal and ghosts and poltergeists and all these other strange topics that delight and titillate ourselves and our audience. But I guess, Nick, you're familiar, and certainly Sean Castillo brought this out in our book, The Matrix Control System of Philip K. Dick, about the many people in the UFO field who seem to have a great number of synchronicities and coincidences in their lives and in their career. In fact, Sean does a very detailed review of Raymond Fowler's book on synchronicities and UFOs. Have you found this to be the case, or have you had any personal experiences along this line? I know you have a chapter in the book, so why don't you just hop into this topic, and then we'll get into Roswell in a few minutes.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've had a lot, too many to count, I guess, over the years, synchronicities, and some of them, are sort of really kind of bizarre, just, unbelievably bizarre. And I always tell people that, honestly, I don't know what it is that causes synchronicities, what the intelligence is that makes these things happen. But I always tell people never to ignore them, because, it's not like something that's being forced on you. It's kind of like if you follow the trail of the synchronicity, it may lead to help you with the work you're doing. I've found that a number of times where synchronicities has occurred. It actually helps, perhaps with a book that I'm working on, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I think synchronicities are kind of directed at us, but it's up to us whether we actually follow up on the synchronicity and see what it means, or people dismiss it. I mean, to give you a good example, I'm writing a new book now, which comes out in February next year, all about the Slender Man mystery. And just over the course of writing that book, I've had so many weird 11/11 synchronicities happen. At the time I'm writing the book, and I just I'm working on it, just happened to look round to 11/11, or a message will come through on my cell phone 11/11, and it's happened so much, particularly with this book. So again, the whole 11/11 thing and synchronicities is an entire phenomenon all on its own. But 11/11s, I get no end of those, and it's not like a case of looking for them. The skeptics might think it's just they happen while you're just not thinking about it, and they occur. But I've had a lot also in relation to the contactee movement over the years. I'll give you one sort of weird example. Years ago, this was about 7 or 8 years ago, I was writing an article, it was on a Sunday morning, about Truman Bethurum and his contactee experience with this hot-looking space woman named Aura Raines.
Oh, yeah.
And she was supposedly from this planet called Clarion. Well, it so happens that just purely down to coincidence, like about an hour and a half after writing this article, I actually came across an old book which had the word Clarion on the title of the book. Nothing to do with UFOs. It was actually an early 1980s school, graduation book. And it had the word, the printer on the front was Clarion. Mm-hmm. And so people think, well, that's just, that's a coincidence. But I get so many like that to the point where it just becomes, I don't say ridiculous, because that kind of sounds like a criticism. It's not, but it just makes me realize that, when you're talking about, the Matrix and things like that, it makes me realize that whatever reality is, we're not seeing full reality. We get glimpses of the weirder side of reality, but there's far more going on than we can sort of, comprehend or understand right now. And I think synchronicities are a part of whatever that matrix is, that is kind of, I would say programming us in a sinister way, but like I said, giving us the choice to follow some kind of unreality, if we choose to do it.
Well, some of the some of the synchronicities are positive. Some of them, like the deaths of the UFO researchers on June 24th,
Yeah.
one would think of in a negative way. But the strange thing there about that date, of course, it is the anniversary of Kenneth Arnold's UFO sighting over Mount Rainier, which is kind of the beginning of the modern flying saucer era.
Mhm.
But the synchronicity here isn't just the fact that over a dozen UFO researchers have passed away on that particular date, but the fact that Kenneth Arnold did not believe that the UFOs that he saw, and he had at least a dozen, if not more, sightings over the years. Most people don't realize that. He did not believe that they were an extraterrestrial in origin. He thought that they were some kind of craft that came to pick up the spirits or souls of the deceased and take them over to some other realm. So if that doesn't tie in, or if that isn't part of some overall synchronicity there with the June 24th date, I don't know, what is. But, in our book, UFO Repeaters, we talk about people who have had, UFO sightings and the ability to go out at night or in the daytime and repeatedly take photographs of strange objects in the sky. But there also seem to be synchronicity synchronicity repeaters. Like I have enough to fill 80 or 100 pages in the book, Tim, because he's been laying it out. And there's at least, and we're not just talking about the telephone rings and it's somebody that I was thinking about the day before or something. I mean, we're talking about very strange and very complex synchronicities, like the weekend that I spent with the librarian from APRO, which of course is the Area Phenomena Research Organization in Tucson, which has been defunct now for over 20 years. And I go with my friend Charlotte. We drive down to Sedona, and we stop in to have a brunch at this a place called the Coffee Pot, where you can get 103 kinds of omelets. And on the way out the door, there's a car parked next to us in the parking lot of the coffee shop with the license plate APRO on it in big, bold letters. Now, how is that possible? I mean, the organization has been defunct, but let's say, for example, there is a fan of APRO out there somewhere, and would pay to have license plates made up with that spelling on there. But why would it be parked next to our car? I mean, nobody knew where we were going to be. It's just like the things that happen are just beyond the realm of possibility. It's like winning the lottery over and over again. So there you go. I mean, the whole program tonight isn't about synchronicities, but I certainly was thrilled to hear about this.
It is an interesting area. It is an interesting area because the interesting thing is it's not like it's just directed at ufology. I mean, yes. I get it in relation to Men in Black stuff, cryptozoology, so it actually covers the spectrum of the paranormal,
Absolutely.
Not just, UFOs. That kind of suggests that whatever the phenomenon is, it sort of, it covers the entire range of the paranormal, which makes me wonder, perhaps we should be looking at the origins of the UFO phenomenon itself in different angles, rather than just the kind of tired and bit worn out angle of nuts and bolts spacecraft.
Indeed. Hey, Nomar, are you up in Maine? Is that where you reside?
Yes, I'm up in Bangor.
Now, have you come across any weird synchronicities or anything that would tie in with this?
Yeah, I interviewed a woman from Stratton, Maine. She had a series of missing time events in relation to a UFO sighting. And she started having dreams after these UFO sightings. And in her dreams, she was on a spaceship with just her husband. There was nobody else. Everything was in white. And every time her husband opened up his mouth to speak, a song by Pink Floyd would come out of his mouth. I believe it was called Interstellar Overdrive, I think was the name of it. And, she thought that was so odd. So the morning that she was driving over to meet us, that song was playing on the radio. And, the synchronicity was not lost on her and certainly not us,
Yeah, that's a song that doesn't get a lot of regular airplay on the radio, though.
It's a long one too.
It is. Yeah, so that would be unusual to hear that one just at that place and time.
Yep.
Now, how did you begin your investigation of UFOs? The book that you've done here, UFOs over Maine, Close Encounters from the Pine Tree State, is not really the first book that you've done. But how did you make the giant leap from normalcy into the world of ufology?
Good question. First of all, I want to say thanks so much for having me on the show.
Oh, you're welcome.
And what an honor it is to have Nick Redfern here. So hi, Nick. How you doing, buddy?
Hello, thanks. Thanks a lot.
But guys, to be honest, I'm a nobody. I'm just a regular guy. I have a family. I have a girl that I adore as the day is long. I have an 11-year-old son who's amazing. I'm obsessed with old school hip hop and iced coffees. The three of your names kind of sound like a hip hop beat to me, like a Tim and Tim. You know?
Okay.
But I am utterly fascinated with UFOs, alien abduction, Men in Black, Mothman, Bigfoot, on and on and on. And as a child, I was maybe 5 years old. Could have been 4, could have been 6. And honestly, if I'm wavering in what the age was, then who knows how good my memory is on what I actually saw. But because I cannot play it back in my adult mind. But what I saw as a child was like a lightning bolt stuck in the clouds. I had woken up due to the sound of thunder. I sat up in my bed. My house bedroom window faced the St. John River, stone's throw from Connecticut. And I saw a lightning bolt stuck in the clouds, and there was electricity coming off it, and it was glowing. And when I woke up in the morning, I fell back asleep, not really sure what happened. I just kind of fell back asleep, woke up in the morning, and it's still there. I went to show my dad, and it was gone by the time I brought him up to my room to show him. And I don't know why I didn't just bring him outside to look at it, but it was gone. And then a few months later, that was followed by by me witnessing the Aurora Borealis, or the Northern Lights, as we call it in Maine, and I'm sure other places. But those two events taught me something at a very young age. And it is that our world is much bigger and much more odd than I knew it before those events. And it just weighed heavily on my young mind. And then I heard about the Allagash abductions, which took place in Maine. And ever since then, my eyes have been to the sky and reading everything I could on UFOs. There's only been a few books published from Maine authors that do mention UFOs, but they're not solely dedicated to UFOs. And with my obsession, I figured I would want to write that book. So I did that with UFOs over Maine, Volume 1, and I just wrapped up Volume 2. And there's a lot of weird stuff that happens here, guys.
Yeah, I think Tim Beckley sent me what was it, Tim? Like MUFON said that Maine is like the
third state.
Is it the third state?
UFOs, yeah, third, I think it said, right?
Yeah. Did you realize that, no, Mark?
Actually, I did. So I brought it up to Valerie Schultz. Valerie Schultz is now the MUFON state director for Maine. John Ventry has stepped down. And what's going on with Ventry anyways? Have you guys heard about all that stuff?
No. Tell us.
Okay. He made a lot of racist comments on his Facebook page.
I read something about that. Yeah.
And I guess
the internet.
Yeah, and I guess Jan or Jan, I'm not sure how he pronounces his name, but the head of MUFON finally released a statement about it today, which was kind of lame in my opinion, but interesting stuff. Anyways, Valerie Schultz is now the state director of Maine and New Hampshire, actually, and we saw this, come out, so we looked at it, and she went through the database, and she was seeing that she can't really say that the sightings have increased. What we're finding, actually, specifically for Maine anyways, I can't speak for the other states, but specifically for Maine, a lot of the reports, if you dig into them, are reports from the 60s and 70s that people are reporting now. For example, the 1964 Loring Air Force Base encounter, which is not talked about. It's mostly the 1975 encounter. That was reported in 2006. And a lot of people, didn't want to be ridiculed at that time. So a lot of of these, people in their 60s, 70s, 80s are now reporting. We have a great report from Dow Air Force Base, which is right up here in Bangor. And that gentleman didn't report that until 2016, so it might look like an increase in sightings, but it's an increase in people reporting, if you will. But I don't think there's any more lights in the sky than perhaps.
Well, tell us about the earlier Loren Air Force Base incident. I'm not sure I'm familiar with that one.
Yeah, in 1964, there was a gentleman who was an air policeman, and he was, working duty on the base, and he was close to the runway, and he saw a UFO hovering just about 5 feet above the runway, and there was no lights on it. It was completely black, so it was kind of like black on black, and which is very similar to the 1975 encounter. That UFO also hovered over the base, but the lights were over the runway, but the lights were on. It was about 3 feet above the runway, and as he's watching it, he sees a service truck start heading down the runway towards it. And that type of truck is typically used for guiding flight paths for the planes that are going about to take off on base. And so it wasn't, the military police jeeps that he's used to seeing. So he thought it was weird that it was a truck going there. So he's looking at the truck. He looks back to the UFO and it's gone. So he starts walking towards where he saw the UFO. He sees another air policeman and asked if he saw it as well. He said he did. He was even closer. And he said that the UFO had a lot of flat panels on it. At different angles, and it had a matte finish to it, and it took off at such speed that it kind of blurred out of existence, is how that gentleman described it. And then there was a few months later that same year, I believe it was December of '64, there was another air policeman who was on patrol. He was by the bomber area, which were armed with nuclear weapons at the time. And he's doing his patrol, and it's the middle of the night, and he sees shadows walking amongst the snowbanks, which are behind the B-52 bombers. And so he sees those, and he actually fires off a warning shot and tells whoever it is to come out. Once everything kind of goes silent, they step out into the moonlight, and he fires at them. And as soon as he fires at them, they vanish, according to him. And then the base comes to life. The lights come on, more air policemen come, and they apprehend that airman for firing live rounds so close to nuclear weapons. He tried explaining why he did it, but they wouldn't listen to him. So he was relieved of duty, and he was, he was kind of a joke of the base, for like the next year, the guy who shot at Little Green Men. And when he was asked about it a few months after he was relieved of duty, he said, they were gray, they're not green. So he's still sticking to his story, Interesting stuff.
Really
well,
is.
talking about UFOs being shot at, I remember this, and I think we mentioned in an email, an incident that took place, what was it, in 1965 or 66, where a fellow by the name of John King actually shot at a UFO. And now, there's some discrepancy whether the bullets actually struck the craft or they didn't. Can you tell us that story? I mean, I'm sure I know you've written it up in your book there.
Yeah. I actually live just 1 block away over from where this occurred. It occurred on Mount Hope Avenue, and he was driving along, and there was a hospital right on Mount Hope at one point, and there was a swampy area next to it. So he's driving down the road, and in the swampy area, he sees an overturned car. And he doesn't see any emergency vehicles on site yet, so he screeches to a halt, gets out of the car, and kind of manages the swampy area, trying to avoid, the wet bits, if you will. And as he's making his way over there, he looks up at the overturned car and finds out that he is gravely mistaken, and it is in fact a UFO hovering just just above the ground. It starts kind of wobbling back and forth, and then slowly starts heading right towards him. Well, this terrifies him, so he runs back to his car, and he has a 22 gun in his car, so he grabs for it, and he accidentally fires it off, just from like his agitated state, And he also saw that the gunshot did not seem to do anything to the UFO. It didn't seem to react in any way. So he actually took aim and aimed right at the UFO and took a shot. And he did not hit it, and it still was coming towards him. And then he took aim one last time and took shot at the UFO, actually hit it. And with the clang, like he heard the clang of the bullet hitting it, the UFO like instantly ascended. It was interesting too. About 30 days later, there was a young girl. She was 6 years old, in the town of Bingham, Maine, and she saw a bubble-like UFO land in a field, and it had a door. And the way she described the UFO and the way John King described his UFO, they could look like vehicles, or overturned cars. And with the sightings just 30 days apart and about 60 miles apart, I'm wondering if it could have been the same craft.
Well, also too, there is this a billboard that was put up. Was that around the same time where they in Brewer?
Yeah, that was 1966. The mayor put that up, actually, but it was more done so tongue-in-cheek, and it said, UFOs welcome, something like that. Lots available for landing, and but sort of tongue-in-cheek. And he was actually trying to drive businesses to Brewer, and it actually ended up working. But in 1966, in Elliott, Maine, which is way at the southern tip of Maine, you're just about getting into Massachusetts at that point, and New Hampshire. In Elliott, Maine, there was a UFO flap, and you could see, or it was described by witnesses, that you could just see fleets of UFOs nightly following the river down in Elliott. And it got so regular and so consistent that food trucks and food carts would set up shop there because so many people would show up to watch the UFOs. Police were called in just to manage traffic. It was really, really interesting. And that was in 1966. And he was trying to capitalize on that.
Well, speaking of capitalizing, this weekend, the 20th of May, there is the one-day festival in Pine Bush, New York, festival and parade. I understand Travis Walton is going to be there. Linda Zimmerman, who was on our program last week. Plenty of free lectures, plenty of excitement. It's something for the entire family. Of course, Pine Bush, New York, going back about 20 years ago, was a hotspot as far as UFOs go.
We'll be right back.
Exploring the bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe, exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Welcome back to the second hour of Exploring the Bizarre. And as always, I encourage you, our beloved listeners, to send us questions for our guests, if you have any. We love to hear from you, and there's, I don't want to say there's no question too dumb for us, because even we have our limits, but hey, go for it. We'll if we don't say it on the air, we'll get a good laugh out of it. Let me put it that way. So let's bring Nick Redfern back into the conversation, Tim. And Nick, I wanted to ask you about your book, The Roswell UFO Conspiracy, Exposing a Shocking and Sinister Secret. Now, what made you decide to write this sequel, considering how much abuse that you received concerning the first one? I mean, I have never seen so many people just get their panties in a bunch, over that over your original book. I mean, it's just and I have to tell you something. I mean, I think the first one and now the sequel. I mean, it's really something to think about. But I mean, I mean, are you just like a like a masochist or something that you just wanted to repeat the experience again, or?
No, well, I mean, I actually don't mind a good, fight and argument. So, I'll give the abuse back as much as they dish it out. That's why it went on for so long, because, if you're the kind of character that kind of can't take debate and you just sort of sit in the corner and cower, the conversation's going to end pretty quick. But the reason why it went on and on was because I just constantly hit back at everybody in the same way they hit back at me, But I think, it's actually a good thing to get these issues out, because the thing is, back in 2005, I wrote this book called Body Snatchers in the Desert, which basically looked at the idea in the immediate post-war era, sort of 46, 47. A lot of weird stuff was going on in New Mexico. You had the German paperclip rocket scientists brought over. You had a lot of experiments in high altitude exposure, balloon flights with pigs and monkeys on board to test high altitudes. And there's been rumors over the years about human experimentation involving people sort of clandestinely taken from hospitals and asylums, and tying it all in with the transfer of a lot of balloon-based technology from the Japanese, who were building these very weird balloons in the final stages of the war. So that was basically the theme. That was 2005, and in the 12 years that have gone by since that book came out, I've got a lot more material that basically backs up that theory. Now, for people who haven't sort of read my books, I wouldn't want people to think I'm a UFO skeptic, because I'm not. There's no doubt in my mind there's a real UFO phenomenon. And the reason I got involved in the subjects, my dad was in the British Royal Air Force. He was a radar mechanic, and he was involved in several UFO incidents. But even though I'm a full believer in the UFO phenomenon, I'm not convinced that a UFO crashed at Roswell. And the more I've dug into this, the more I've found additional material on this angle of sort of dark and disturbing human experimentation related to high altitude flights, massive balloons, all in the skies over New Mexico in the summer of 1947. Now, in terms of, am I a masochist? No. I put the book out because I'd got enough new material now to allow for a book to be written on the subject, which wouldn't be filled with filler, and was of a good length for the reader. But my view has always been, if you uncover something, well, put it out there, because I always tell people that, the term UFO, the U still stands for unidentified. We're not really sure what, not just the phenomenon is, but what the individual cases are. So I think ufology's biggest mistake is elevating Roswell to the number one event, because whenever you put all your eggs in one basket, if it crashes, then everything comes crashing around with it, not because it should do, but because the case is perceived as the best one, and then people think, well, if that's the best one and it collapses, what does it say for the rest? So, I think that's ufology's big problem, and I don't see anything wrong with questioning, the status quo, so to speak. If I see evidence, I'm not one to sort of shy away from sharing controversial material if I think it's going to further ufology. Now, so that's basically, again, with the theme of the new book. There's a lot more material related to, most people who sort of know their post-war history know about the German paperclip program to bring the German rocket scientists over. But there's a lesser known, much lesser known Japanese equivalent, where Japanese scientists were brought over, and some of them were working on very controversial programs like human experiments to determine how people would be affected by high and low pressures, in the atmosphere, that kind of thing. And what's particularly intriguing is that a number of the witnesses to the bodies at Roswell never described them as, looking like the so-called greys. And you don't hear much about this in ufology, interestingly enough. But Melvin Brown, one of the witnesses to the bodies, his exact words were, they could have passed for Chinese. And something else a lot of people don't realize is that just literally down the road almost from the Foster Ranch where the wreckage was found by rancher Matt Brazel, there's an old military base called Fort Stanton. In the Second World War, Fort Stanton was home to Japanese enemy aliens, as they were known at that time. They were sort of, under guard there. And also, Fort Stanton operated immediately afterwards as a place where handicapped and people with psychological disturbances were held. This all comes to play in this story, and it's right in the vicinity of the ranch where the crash happened. So there's a lot of stuff like that in the book. Now, of course, people who are very sort of driven by, the I want to believe factor, they're just going to say, Nick's been deceived or lied to. Now, admittedly, I can never dispute that or deny it, I should say, because I can never say for sure that it wasn't disinformation or it isn't disinformation. But when the stories are coming from numerous different people, and not just to me, but to other researchers, like in the book I talk about an Australian researcher, Keith Basterfield. Keith was actually given practically the same story as me, but he got it before Body Snatchers came out, and he kept quiet about it. And it was only when my book came out that he was like, whoa, this sounds like the same story. Popular Mechanics were given this Japanese angle for the Roswell bodies back in 1997. They published a story about that they'd been told of a forthcoming release of documents, which didn't happen. But so those are the kind of reasons why I don't think it's disinformation. But I think, it's important to get the story out, because if we have been following the wrong track for so long with Roswell, then we shouldn't ignore that. I think there is this issue where for a lot of people, ufology is just like a business or, something that we've got to uphold. Well, no, I mean, for me, we've got to go where the answers are and not just hold up old paradigms or whatever because they're exciting or cool. We just need to go for the answers, and whatever the answers are, good, bad, somewhere in between, that's how it goes,
Well, now, just how reliable are the reports of alien bodies associated with Roswell crash anyway?
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because Kevin Randall, who is, one of the... I actually talk about Kevin quite a bit in the book, because for me, he's the most level-headed of the pro-UFO researchers for Roswell. But in his latest book, Roswell in the 21st Century, Kevin actually makes it very clear that he now dismisses nearly all the alien body accounts from the Roswell crash, which in one sense probably surprised a lot of people, but also, it's brave of him to do that, because of, how many books he's written on Roswell from a pro-alien perspective. Mm-hmm. And, when you find that, then I think, it doesn't add weight to the theory that I'm talking about, but it does demonstrate that people are now looking at Roswell from a more critical perspective, whereas before it was people wanted to believe it because it was exciting, it was conspiratorial, and I think that's the problem with Roswell. On the one hand, it's ironic because it is so intriguing, it captivates people, and people don't want to lose what it is that captivates them, and what captivates them is the alien angle. That is what it comes down to.
Well, and the whole idea of using people as guinea pigs, I mean, it's not without precedent. I know that the Japanese did during World War II, and probably before with Chinese prisoners. The Soviet Union allegedly used mentally handicapped people to put close to their atomic bomb test, and allegedly the United States did the same thing in some of the locations in New Mexico and I think Nevada as well. So the idea that the U.S. May have used humans in these experiments, I mean, to me, I don't find that too far-fetched.
No, I mean, it's also, I mean, in England, where I'm from, about 20 years ago, the British government started to release files showing that back in the 50s, they'd used LSD on unwitting or unknowing soldiers, basically to see how they'd be affected on the battlefield, if some sort of psychedelic was kind of, unleashed, so to speak. And so, things like this have gone on. And I mean, certainly in the early 1990s, there was the whole, under the Clinton administration, this committee that looked into human radiation experiments and things like that. So, this is one of the things that, often does happen all around the world, that, sometimes the line gets crossed. Now, regardless of what people think did come down on the ranch in 47, the fact is, superficially, it does look like, balloon wreckage, debris, foil, etc. Now, one of the things a lot of people don't know, the ranch itself, the Foster Ranch, was and still is. It's a gigantic ranch. I've been out there, sort of tour around there. A lot of people don't know that Brazel, the rancher who found the wreckage, actually admitted that he found wreckage from 2 previous military balloons on the ranch. So, in other words, things were coming down across New Mexico, raining down from the sky, because you had so many military bases performing a lot of experimental activities like Alamogordo, White Sands. Then also, in New Mexico, you had the Los Alamos labs where the atomic bomb was developed, and numerous other installations like Kirtland. And you put all that together with the time frame and the scientists being brought over and looking into new technologies for aircraft and high-altitude flights, and then suddenly this weird thing comes down in New Mexico, and amid tales of not just UFOs, but human experiments and handicapped people and Japanese people brought over and given one of those offers you can't refuse, you blend all those things together, and there is sort of a dark picture that could push Roswell in a different direction. But the backlash has already started, and I've done some shows where it's got heated, and that's fine. I can punch back as hard as anybody else, and I will. And because I think it's important to support what you believe. If you believe in something, not just on belief, but because you conclude it's the right answer and you have the right evidence. But the one downside, and it is a downside, not to the theory itself, but nearly all the old-timers I interviewed said that because this was sort of these events, there was supposedly like 7 or 8 of these experiments in New Mexico between 45 and roughly 48, thereabouts. And they said that because not too much was learned from this, and the experiments were seen as sort of semi-illegal, and people were worried about what would happen to them, for kind of allowing these events to go ahead, that everything was destroyed. In other words, the documents were destroyed, shredded, burned, whatever. There would be no reason to keep, wreckage of balloons, and arguably there was no real point in keeping the bodies of the people who were involved. So most people who I interviewed who had some knowledge of the events back then, old-timers, etc., from the military, said that as far as they knew, everything was destroyed back then. Now, if that is the case, then it may, and the theory is true, it may actually be impossible to prove what happened if, some agency or somebody in the government decided that everything's got to be taken away, and destroyed. And it is interesting that when the Air Force went looking in 93 and 94, they found that all the outgoing messages from the Roswell Army Air Force Base from 45 to 51 were gone. Now, that's not real, but that's a fact. Every outgoing message from the Roswell base from 45 to 51 cannot be found. And there's no indication when that material vanished. It was only when people with the Air Force went looking for answers for Roswell in the early 90s that then they realized, well, hang on, where's all this material? So there could be something to that idea that, because if it was a UFO crash, then none of that material would ever be destroyed because it would be unique material that we could learn a massive amount from. But if it was a secret experiment, then you could argue that everything would be destroyed, So it's... but then again, other people have said to me, no, that some of the files were kept and are still preserved. So there could still be, light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak.
Well, I think Nomar had a question that he'd like to ask you, Nick. Go ahead, Nomar.
I was wondering how this plays into the supposed 2 crash locations, that have since come out.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, this actually sort of plays into the story because the people I interviewed, and also with the Popular Mechanics story, when they came out with theirs in '97, the overriding explanation I got was that the one that came down on Roswell was kind of like a 2-part device. It was one of these huge balloons that the Japanese, or based on these huge balloons that the Japanese were building in the closing stages of the war. I mean, like gigantic balloons. And they would have hanging beneath them like an early kind of lifting body, like a lifting body glider type craft, which could be... Basically, the idea was you'd have these huge balloons flying along at speed, and you would have these detachable gliders, which would detach from the balloon. Now, according to the story, what happened? There was some sort of aerial high altitude calamity where the balloon, where the lifting body didn't detach properly or normally from this huge balloon. And what happened was that instead of gliding down, it plummeted to the ground. So you have this heavy aircraft plummeting to the ground, and the balloon was badly damaged, so that came down as well. But what happened is that the craft itself, because it was heavy, slammed down to the ground vertically. But the balloon wreckage, which exploded in the sky, because that was just light, foil, that kind of rained down, but because of the lightness of it, the trajectory took it to one part of the ranch, but the craft plummeting down at high speed and being heavy came down immediately to another part. It's kind of like if you drop a rock from a building and you also drop, 200 pieces of paper, the paper's not going to come down anywhere near the rock. And it was kind of like that. You have the balloon and the craft, and that's why there were 2 crash sites. So,
wow.
Which it does make sense, but whether or not, the skeptics would say, well, that's a convenient cover story to hide the fact that either 2 UFOs came down or, So until I'm honest enough to admit, some people will say, they've solved Roswell and it's extraterrestrial. I won't say that I've solved Roswell by saying it's a human experiment. As far as I can go, because I think this is the responsible way, is I think there's enough evidence to strongly push it in that direction. But if we're honest with ourselves, unless or until we get a real smoking gun, it's going to end up like Jack the Ripper, with so many different theories and ideas, but it's so long ago you kind of hit a brick wall. It's kind of that sort of parallel,
Nick, if you don't mind, I got one more question. About 6 years later, Kingman, Arizona. You think something similar? They call it the lesser known Roswell.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it could be. I mean, the thing is, we do know that in the 40s and 50s, there were like a lot of psychological warfare operations put into place by the military of a number of countries to actually sort of seed bogus UFO stories to cover up other things. That has happened on a number of occasions. So, yes, it could happen. And, I think arguably, presenting something as a UFO and actually wasn't, what that often does is that it keeps the mainstream serious investigative journalists away from the story, because none of them want to be known as the guy who, the journalist who investigates little green men. But,
right.
Something arguably of a more down-to-earth explanation they would look into. But keeping people away by, tales of aliens, little green men, etc., little grey men, whatever, that actually, has a bearing not just on ufology, but on the mainstream media, who won't touch a UFO story unless there's kind of like at least one little joke they can make in the story, in the news story. So, I think from my perspective, we need to look at each UFO case on its own merit or lack of merit, and then try, not try and piece it all together as just one huge piece of ufology. Look
so would you say then, Nick, there are no legitimate UFO crashes? Because we do have hundreds of reports. In fact, now, according to Bill Burns, he said that there's 1,000 cases of supposed UFO crashes around the world. They have occurred, supposedly have occurred in other countries besides the United States, and they have occurred even in recent years, where these experiments would no longer be going on.
Well, I mean, I don't rule out the possibility of UFO crashes, ironically enough. What I'm trying to do here, one of ufology's big problems, I'm looking at this as one case, but very often there's this temptation in ufology to lump things together. If a UFO was seen hovering over Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico, and then 3 hours later someone saw something, hovering over somewhere in New York or whatever on the same night, there might be a tendency to think, well, it's the same craft. But it may not be. Do you see what I mean? That's one of the things. Just because
Nick, I'm going to have to interrupt you here because we have to go to our break at the bottom of the hour. So stay tuned for more Exploring the Bizarre.
Now back to Exploring the Bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal. Your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
So Tim, it just we always have just the best guests on our show, and here we are. It's the bottom of the hour, and time is rapidly running out. So why don't we bring Nomar back into the conversation here? I know you've got some questions for him.
Well, I know there are some high strangeness cases there in Maine. I think we're pretty much all familiar with the Dr. Hopkins involvement with the Men in Black. Why don't for those of us in the audience there who are not that familiar with the case, why don't you give us some of the details on it? Because it is one of the more fascinating MIB encounters. Yeah.
It certainly is. So back in 1976, Dr. Herbert Hopkins was conducting some hypnotic regression therapy with a UFO abductee. His name was David Stevens. He was also from Maine. And whilst going through the hypnotic regression therapy, there were probably 5-6 sessions in, and Dr. Herbert Hopkins received a call one night from somebody claiming to be from a UFO bureau out of New Jersey, I believe. Nick, maybe you can correct me. Yeah,
yeah, it was. Yes.
Yeah, and he was warned, or that person said, I'd like to come over and discuss the David Stevens case. He said, sure. In an instant, this person showed up at his doorstep, of course, being back in the 70s. If anything, he was at a payphone and there was no way to get to his home that quickly. So strange encounters ensue while this Men in Black is inside the home of Dr. Herbert Hopkins. The gentleman appeared much like a lot of the Men in Black encounters sound like, mostly from like a keel perspective, with they're gaunt and seem almost mechanical. They speak in weird speech patterns, almost like they don't fully understand our language. And the Men in Black proceeded to threaten Mr. Hopkins to stop working on the David Stevens case. And if he didn't, he kind of performed a paranormal parlor trick, if you will. And he had Dr. Hopkins pull out a coin from his pocket and the Men in Black made the coin disappear. It got all fuzzy and then disappeared, and said the same thing would happen to your heart if you don't stop working on this case. Then the Men in Black left. And the wife came home, and all the lights in the house were on, and he was sitting there holding a gun, and he had thrown all of his casework and audio tapes in the fire. That same night, while his wife and son were at the movies, the wife claims to have seen a UFO hovering over the movie theater, which is kind of interesting. And these
that's a synchronicity by all.
It is. And for the next few weeks, they were plagued by weird phone calls, which, of course, is a Men in Black trait. And also, Herbert's son, John, had a peculiar visitor one day. It was a man and woman. John actually went and picked him up, which was interesting. He got a phone call and didn't seem to know the people, but he went and picked him up anyways, brought him back to their house, and it was a man and a woman in black. Nick, I know you wrote the Women in Black book. So it was a man and a woman in black, and they were behaving oddly, even in a sexual manner, and they were asking John and John's wife, as they performed sexual acts, if they were doing it correctly. And this was all being reported as part of this Men in Black encounter. So on a much smaller scale.
We've heard of shades of gray. Now we've got shades of black, I guess.
There you go. On a much smaller scale, not like Nick's Roswell revelation, if you will. But I did find some additional information about the Herbert Hopkins case that I actually haven't seen come out anywhere at all. And I like to tell the truth to a fault, if you will. And I think it's okay to go against the grain, especially like Nick was saying, if it's new evidence and it's a supported theory, it's not just a wild accusation, and can it move ufology forward? So in 2008, the nephew of Herbert Hopkins, his name was Howard. He unfortunately passed away in 2012 at the age of 50. But in 2008, he is also a local Maine author, and he wrote Westerns and some horror stories. And he even created this series of book called The Chloe Files. And he wrote in a blog about his uncle and telling the true story of what really happened with his uncle. And he went on to say that Herbert suffered from alcoholism and was prone to flights of fancy. And even though he enjoyed sci-fi stories, he was really poor at writing them until he came up with this Men in Black story. And so Howard, until the day he died, claimed that Herbert's story is completely false, and it was made up, and to get Herbert's 15 minutes of fame, and also the encounters with John and John's wife. Turns out, in his opinion, that they were swinger couples that would come and go often and could even be seen be performing sexual acts. Now, with that said, Howard does have some credibility here. He was very close to his uncle. He gained no notoriety from disclosing this. He just put it on his personal blog, which he did not advertise. And he actually lived with Herbert during this time frame, which is why his insight is what it is. So I tracked down Dominique Hopkins, who is Howard's wife, and I talked to her about her thoughts on Howard's thoughts on Herbert and what happened. And she does not side with her husband. She believes Herbert's story. But she also loves her husband dearly and knows that he's, fastidious with his research, and didn't really fall to all things paranormal. He didn't believe in psychics. He didn't believe in the Loch Ness Monster, but he did believe in UFOs, and he did believe in Men in Black, but wanted to point out that this story was not, in fact, a Men in Black story. But that's pretty much it in a nutshell.
Well, it's not unusual, however, for members of a family to come out against a story. One that comes to mind is Betty Andreasen, where
Yep.
what was it her son says that the whole thing was concocted. Of course, now Betty's daughter, on the other hand, has had experiences of her own. Then, of course, you have good old Ed Walters and his sensational UFO photographs, where somebody claims that they actually found a miniature replica of one of his craft hidden away in the attic wall, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever to me. And there's even some on the internet. I've seen some stories about Travis Walton.
Which like I find, in a drug-induced state for 5 days.
Something to that effect, which I find very hard to believe. I mean, people have hung out with Travis Walton here over the years. I've never heard any rumors of him, abusing drugs or anything like that. I don't know.
And not to mention the tests that he had performed, afterwards, with nothing in his system. It's interesting you mentioned Andreessen. Ray Fowler was, obviously the investigator there, and he wrote 3 books, I believe, on the incident.
Oh, at least, yes.
Incidents, yeah. But he is now residing in Maine, and he worked on the Allagash abduction book as well. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of just some FYI info, if you will, but he's now teaching a class down in Kennebunk, Maine, that you can take for just about, I can't remember if it's $45, $60, but it's, he'll teach classes or courses on, the afterlife, alien abduction, some really cool stuff. So it's interesting. He's a bit retired now, he's given over his casework to a lot of people, but he's still, active in the community. It's pretty cool.
Well, he is certainly an astute researcher. I mean, he was responsible for bringing out the original details about the Kingman, Arizona UFO. Harry Drew, who we've had on the program several times, very fascinating individual. He doesn't call them UFO crashes per se. They were UFO landings. I mean, they were kind of staged events. No sign that the object actually crashed into the desert per se. And of course, he's got a lot of strange tales of occupants, including 2 of them that were supposed occupants of the one of the ships that was locked up in a jail cell and completely disappeared. I mean, very, very, very strange, unusual, Fortean type of events. Now, Tim Schwartz and I have our theory is, of course, is that the Roswell UFO crash and some of these other events that took place around the late 1940s and early 1950s were crafts that were developed by the Germans during the end of World War II, perhaps based on information that was being channeled to them as early as the 1920 or so. And the reason we've come to believe that is that, first of all, some of the UFO occupants were heard to speak in German during some of these early UFO contact cases. In one particular incident, the boot print was left in the soil, and the plaster Paris casts were made, and the plaster Paris casts show what appears to be a swastika imprinted in the bottom of the boot. Now, why would an alien from some other planet have a swastika there? I mean, our contention is that it points to a project, a paperclip, and all these German scientists and engineers that were brought into the country, many of whom were Nazi war criminals. In fact, even Walter von Braun was known to be a member of the SS, and they were cleared of all charges so that they could come in and work on our early rocket program. I mean, and I think part of the cover-up is that those involved in the Roswell crash and some of these other incidents would rather have you believe that they were extraterrestrials than admit that this government might have been in console with these German Nazi scientists. Our theory. Okay. Anyway, tell us a little bit about the Alabash incident. I mean, that's a fascinating case, and it involves more than one witness. Were there 3 or 4 men that were involved?
Yeah, there was 4 men involved, and again happened in the late 70s, 1976 to be exact. And these 4 friends, 2 of them were actually identical twin brothers, and there's been some theories about twins and abductions, but they were all going to college together in Massachusetts, and they came up to Maine to do some fishing and hang out for 2 weeks, a little break from school, and they saw a UFO the second night that they were at the Allagash Wilderness Waterway, and there were other witnesses there that also saw the UFO. And then about 4, 5, 6 nights later, they had decided to go canoeing out on Eagle Lake, and they wanted to do some night fishing. And so they built a big bonfire, that stood probably 6, 7, 8 feet, flame-wise, and they took off. And they saw the UFO again while they were out canoeing, and they finished their fishing and came back. They were gone for probably an hour, is what they thought. And when they came back, their big bonfire was only embers. And that seemed really odd to them. And they had vague memories of potentially, being abducted, but nothing was really concrete with them until one of the gentlemen, Jim Weiner, he went to a UFO conference. He met with Ray Fowler and let him know that he had been having these vague memories coming through his dreams. He was having aliens poking and prodding him. So we spoke to Ray Fowler about it, and Jim Weiner, he disclosed that he'd begun having seizures as a result of these dreams. And Fowler agreed to help the 4 men with hypnosis sessions. And through those hypnosis sessions is where the abduction story came out. And it reads like a classic abduction story, like no new things to cover there. But just recently, Chuck Rack, he is one of the abductees from the story. Just recently, he has come out and said that the abduction never happened. And he does claim that they did see UFOs, but he also claims that they used drugs and drank, and that they created the story to hopefully make some money. And they didn't make very much money. And the 3 remaining believers, if you will, had a falling out with Chuck. And Chuck stopped appearing at conferences with them. And the other 3 gentlemen were very, if you've ever seen interviews with them, Open Minds website has a great interview with the 3 gentlemen, if you want to check it out. Come across extremely sincere, and Chuck Rack really comes across as extremely hostile. And he's actually been banned from some UFO conventions that he can't come anymore.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. So, and I'm a little bit biased as well. The Allagash abduction story was like my first foray into, UFO stories. I couldn't believe something like that happened in Maine. Of course, as a kid, I heard about Roswell and, these different things. But wow, there was this thing that happened in Maine, and, pretty major. And it was covered on Unsolved Mysteries. And the 4 guys were on the Joan Rivers show. And, it was crazy. And so I have like a soft spot for it. And when I, read this about Chuck, and he was interviewed by a local paper here, and he was just tearing them apart. And the one place he was really tearing them apart was the fire. And the fire is kind of the crux of the missing time piece of it, And if that goes away, it kind of crumbles the rest of the story, if you will, So Chuck Rack was saying that that fire made sense to burn down in an hour. There was no missing time. And, the biggest pieces of wood they had in there were maybe 3 inches in diameter. And the other gentlemen have, come out and said that he is incorrect. And some of the pieces were actual logs and, were anywhere from 10 to 12 inches in diameter. And there's no way it could have burned down, But there's so much back and forth. It reminds me of the Rendlesham Forest case, where those guys have all that infighting now. You know what I mean? And it's too bad, because all these people are alive, and it would be really great if we could just, all go out to dinner and get along. But such as life exposed.
Well, now, how much in the Allagash incident here? How much do the gentlemen claim that they remember without being hypnosis? Because I'm not totally convinced on this hypnosis thing. I mean, there is
Sure.
hypnosis, obviously, but
Yeah.
one could lead a witness, and it's not necessarily that let's say. Bud Hopkins or these other researchers are leading anybody necessarily.
Intentfully, anyways.
Intentionally, that's the word I was looking for. But it's like Nick and I. We get the bulk of the MIB cases because people know that we're interested in it. If you've had a hostile UFO encounter or abduction, you're going to go to Dr. Jacobson. If you've had an experience that's a very positive in nature, you're probably going to go to John Mack's, foundation. So you kind of drift towards what is most relevant to you. Wouldn't you say that seems to be the case, Nick?
Oh yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we've both written 3 or 4 books each on the Men in Black, and people do kind of gravitate to the people who have written about the subject. You just search around and you find names. And but it's interesting that with the whole Herbert Hopkins story is that over the years I've probably got 7 or 8 really weird Men in Black cases which actually involve coins.
Oh, interesting.
Just like and very often it revolves around gold coins. There's a lot of strange cases linking the Men in Black to gold and also to alchemy, which is, this alleged ancient tradition of changing what are called base metals to precious metals, like from tin to gold. And you have the fact that the Man in Black made the coin vanish. So, that's kind of almost like an alchemical thing as well. So there's little snippets like that from
in Synchronicities, we've got coins repeating themselves over and over again. In fact, we had a lady on our program not too long ago. She did a book. Her name was Nancy. A book called Pennies from Heaven. And her husband who was deceased, was leaving. Pennies were showing up at very odd places and at odd times in her home. And I've had some experiences with the coins that I've related in the book that I've talked about on the air. And we don't have really that much time left to wander off and let me tell a story, because I could take up suck up a good section of airtime.
Tim, will you call me later and tell me a story?
Well, it's in the book. I'll give you a copy.
Oh, cool.
I'll send you a copy of the book. That's our 430-page epic on Philip K. Dick. That's the story. But we're coming down here. In fact, Tina has just sent us over the 4-minute notice. And now she's typing again. So I want to go around to Nick and to you and get all the information about where people can contact you and what you're working on now. So, Nomar, why don't you take it away? Tell us quickly where people can find out more information, your website, and so forth.
Absolutely. Thank you. UFOsovermaine.com. That's where you can buy the book and, read all the stuff that I write about. New book coming out. I believe it's going to be for 2018, but I'm trying to push for 2017. And that's Otherworldly Encounters UFOs Over Maine Volume 2. And you can find me on Facebook at Nomar Slevik Author.
Well, I'm really glad you joined us tonight. You have a wealth of information. And even though Maine may rank third in the country as far as UFO incidents go, most people don't know about them. And Nick, your turn. How do people find out about your continuing research efforts?
Well, I have a blog which I update most days, which the address is nickredfern14.blogspot.com. And the new book, Roswell UFO Conspiracy, you can get from Amazon or order it through Barnes & Noble. And I'll actually be speaking on the book at Roswell for the 70th anniversary on the weekend of the, it's the 3rd of June, 2nd.
You mean they actually let you on the program?
Are you bringing security?
Yeah, I might bring a couple of pairs of boxing gloves. You never know.
All right,
and that'll be fun either way.
And of course, I will be down in Pine Bush this weekend, the 20th of May 2017, at the Pine Bush Festival. And I guess Travis Walton is supposed to be there, and Linda Zimmerman, and that should be quite an event, including a parade and the floats and the whole alien hamburgers and what have you. And then the following weekend, we'll be at the Philip K. Dick Film Festival here in New York, which you can look up on the internet. And Tim, won't you agree? It was a great show this evening. We just pushed and shoved and got some great information out of our guest. And as always, we enjoy hearing from our listeners. And you can find us on YouTube at Mr. UFO's Secret Files. And Tina, take it away. And thank you, Peter. And thank you, Carol. And thank you, Tim. And thank you, our guest for the evening.
Good night, all.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Anytime.
You've been listening to Exploring the Bizarre with hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz. They're taking back the night by jetting non-stop across the cosmos in search of the truly bizarre and totally unexplained, with you as their co-pilot. Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern, on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. For more information on Exploring the Bizarre and hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz, check out their KCOR Digital Radio Network page. Follow their YouTube channel at MRUFO 1100. Exploring the Bizarre.